There is a lot of symbolism in the Bible. Jesus isn't a loaf of bread, and God doesn't actually have feathery wings to cover us. But in this video, I will argue that the Bible has much more symbolism than we have been led to believe by pop Christianity. Take for example Leviathan. I can assure you that Leviathan is not a mosasaur, and Behemoth is not a sauropod, an elephant, or a hippo. In fact, they are not literal animals at all, and the writer of Job expects us to understand that. Many have had a hard time understanding the fact that Leviathan in the passage breathes fire, and some literalists have bit this bullet so hard that their teeth are all over the floor. But in this video, I will show that Leviathan and other topics like it should not be seen as literal at all. Of course, everyone agrees that there is some symbolism in the Bible, but exactly how much is there, and how can we tell the difference between the literal and the symbolic? Should we take the 7 days in Genesis to be symbolic? What about the millennium or the rapture? What about Jesus coming on the clouds or the regathering of the nation of Israel? Many take these concepts to be literal while others do not. But if we're going to understand these things as metaphors, then what's to stop us from understanding the deity of Christ and his resurrection as metaphors as well? What we need is a clear way to read the Bible. Hermeneutics is the study of how to interpret a text, and in this case, the Bible. You can think of hermeneutics like a lens. If you point a camera out into the air with its sensor exposed, you're not going to get a recognizable image. In order to get an accurate image of the world around you, you need a lens to focus the light into a way that the camera can understand. But the choice of which lens will greatly impact what the final image will look like. But if you want an accurate picture of the whole world around you, then a bad lens will cause a distorted outlook. Similarly, if our hermeneutic or method of interpreting the scriptures is faulty, we will have a drastically distorted view of what the Bible is saying. In this case, I want to argue that a strict literal hermeneutic is a bad lens that will create a distorted image, and therefore we need to exchange it for something more accurate. Imagine I said to you, did you catch the Super Bowl last night? The Bears annihilated the Giants. Now imagine this quote was recorded and then buried for thousands of years. Would the literal hermeneutic that people apply to the Bible interpret this statement correctly? Well, a bowl is a device for holding food, and the word super denotes great or massive. So this must be a massive bowl for holding food. And the person clearly has just thrown this bowl and is wondering if the other person has successfully caught it. Additionally, the speaker here goes on to talk about how some very tall individuals were then torn apart and murdered by an ancient and extinct species known as a bear. Such a literal interpretation would absolutely fail in understanding half the things that we say on a daily basis. People don't communicate in the way that the strictly literal hermeneutic implies that we do. Strict literalism is not how we communicate today, and it is certainly not how the biblical writers communicated then. The main problem with most literal hermeneutics is that they are fear-based. If your primary motivation for choosing a certain method of interpreting the scriptures is to avoid symbolizing things like the resurrection, then you are choosing your hermeneutic for the wrong reasons. A fear-based hermeneutic occurs when we are so afraid of symbolizing the deity of Christ or the virgin birth that we refuse to see a metaphor unless it smacks us right between the eyes. That's a metaphor, by the way. But while this concern is actually valid, a strictly literal hermeneutic is not the right solution. Imagine a photographer who's so deathly afraid of making her clients look fat that she chooses an anamorphic lens and purposefully makes all the images look like this. She is purposefully making a bad image because she is so afraid of distortion in the other direction. Consider this diagram. The dots represent individual passages of scripture, and the line represents how much evidence to your eyes there is to consider a passage literal or symbolic. Since our understanding of the evidence is based on perception, as you study a passage more, you might find that it shifts a little bit more to the right or to the left. Consider the story of Noah. No, not the flood story. Right after the flood, Noah got drunk and fell asleep, and meanwhile his son Ham, quote, uncovered his father's nakedness. After that, his father became angry with Ham and cursed him. In this passage, should we interpret the phrase uncovering Noah's nakedness to literally be talking about seeing his father naked, or is there something else going on? Based on what I've told you so far in this passage, there's nothing really to lead us to assume that it's supposed to be symbolic. Therefore, the literal interpretation seems to be the most plausible. But as we study the passage more, we might find that that changes. Consider the fact that Noah was so angry with Ham that he cursed Ham's son Canaan and all of his generation. This seems like a bit of an overreaction if all Ham did was see his father naked. And after all, why would he curse his son rather than Ham himself? However, when Noah's other sons hear about this, they walk backwards to cover Noah with a blanket. This only seems to make sense if Noah is literally naked, and that is indeed the crime that Ham committed. Now let's say we studied the phrase uncovering nakedness a little bit further. Lo and behold, we find that elsewhere in the Old Testament, sleeping with your father's wife counts as uncovering his nakedness. Now add to this, in the ancient world, people would often have sex with their competitors' wives or concubines in order to supplant them. If Ham did such a thing by sleeping with Noah's wife while he was drunk and producing a son Canaan, then this would explain the outrage against Ham, the cursing against Canaan, and the term uncovering nakedness. As you can see from this example, although a passage might initially look either literal or symbolic, as you study it more, you might find that it shifts towards one direction or the other. Next, we place our hermeneutic. This line represents how much evidence is required to determine if something should be considered symbolic versus literal. Those who have a very figurative hermeneutic will require a vast amount of evidence to consider anything to be literal, and those with a literal hermeneutic will do the exact opposite. For this person, almost nothing can convince them that a passage is symbolic unless it involves Jesus calling himself a loaf of bread. And if you're Catholic, even that won't convince you. Ironically, the progressive with an extremely figurative hermeneutic also has a fear-based hermeneutic. Only the progressive is afraid of things like hell, the wrath of God, and the killing of the Canaanites being literal truths. They are afraid of these things being true and must symbolize them in order to get out of believing in it. This is why the answer to the progressive is not, you should adopt my hermeneutic because otherwise you will deny these important doctrines. For the progressive, that's the whole point. You're telling them to adopt your hermeneutic, otherwise they'll achieve the goal they're trying to get to anyway. This is why the true counter to progressive fear-based hermeneutics is not conservative fear-based hermeneutics. The true solution is a truth-based hermeneutic. Radical honesty with ourselves and with what the text actually says is the best way to prevent misreading the Bible. You know that nagging feeling in the back of your mind that you're really forcing a text in order to make it say what you want it to say? I know in my own walk with Christ, when I look back at theological interpretations that I used to hold that I am now embarrassed by, usually that feeling was there and I just didn't realize it at the time. This is why radical honesty with ourselves and with what the text actually says is the best solution to flying off the deep end and interpreting everything as symbolism. The true bar is not on the right or the left, it is right here in the middle. And now we can see that if somebody believes that something is a metaphor when it is not, they have made a false positive error. But if another person denies that something is figurative when it truly is, then they have made a false negative error. The problem with each of these extreme lenses is that they minimize one type of error while maximizing the other. How about we aim for the exact center and try to minimize both types of error? But how do I know that my line is truly in the center? Presumably everyone is trying to put their line right there in the center, and we all think that we have succeeded. If only we had an infallible guideline to see how far from the center we actually are. Well, there actually is. The New Testament authors are an infallible guide to how to interpret the Old Testament. By looking at the way they see the Old Testament, we can understand how we should read the entire Bible. So did they generally see things as literal or as symbolic? Now, the subject of how the New Testament interprets the Old is a massive subject and it is extremely important. But for this video, we're just going to take a look at one example. God prophesies that he will regather the nation of Israel from the Babylonian captivity, he will rebuild the tent of David, and he will have them rule over the nation of Edom and all of the nations that are called by the name of God. There's nothing about this passage that seems to be symbolic, so someone with a literal interpretation would insist that we take this passage at face value. They might even say that this prophesies the restoration of the temple at the end of history. However, the New Testament actually sees this passage as prophesying the resurrection of Jesus and the gathering in of the Gentiles into the covenant people of God. Because of passages like Amos, many people today are looking for a literal fulfillment of the regathering of the nation of Israel. However, the New Testament constantly refers to the church as the true Israel and the grafting in of the Gentiles into the people of God as the true fulfillment of these regathering passages. Therefore, those who see such prophecies as literal have a faulty hermeneutic when we compare it to the New Testament. But what about the example of Leviathan? How do I know for a certainty that this is a metaphor? Firstly, everything about the cultural context of Leviathan suggests that he is a metaphor. The sea was often seen as a representative of chaos, and sea monsters like Leviathan were seen as the embodiment of evil and destruction in the world. Unless you think the Bible has nothing to do with the beliefs of the surrounding culture, then guess again, because the Bible constantly references the same terms used about Leviathan in the surrounding cultures. In Psalm 74, God describes the creation of the world as the crushing of the heads of Leviathan. Last time I checked, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs did not have multiple heads. In the Canaanite religion just next door to the Israelites, we have found a reference to a mythological sea dragon known as Litanu who had 7 heads. Linguists even believe that the word Litanu is the same word as Leviathan, just in the Ugarit language. Additionally, the 7-headed Litanu is described as a fleeing and a twisted feasting serpent, just like the description of Leviathan in Isaiah 27. And in Isaiah 27, we see that Leviathan is defeated around the same time as the wedding supper of the Lamb and the final judgment of the world. If we understand that Leviathan is the representative of all chaos and evil, then it makes sense that he would be defeated at Armageddon. This is also why Ezekiel 38 and 39 use Leviathan-type imagery to describe the hordes of the Antichrist descending on Jerusalem. This theme is picked up in Revelation 13, which describes Satan as beckoning to the sea and the land beast, much like Leviathan and Behemoth. But while there is much more evidence that Leviathan is a symbolic embodiment of all chaos, destruction, and evil, the evidence that I've gone over should be enough to remove all doubt, as if the fire-breathing part wasn't enough. While understanding the Bible is not always a literal book, this is only half the equation that you need to correctly understand the scriptures. There is still one more thing you absolutely need to do if you are going to understand the Bible correctly. In this video, I show you exactly what this is and defeat a common atheist objection to the scriptures in the process.